Misconceptions raise questions to be solved. A lot of D-boys is broke, a lot of homeless got jobs. You could make 8 bones an hour till you pass out and still be ass out. Most pyramid schemes don't let you cash out. They say this generation make the harmony break, but crime rise consistent with the poverty rate. You take the workers from jobs, you gon' have
Well, welcome sisters and brothers and comrades. I want to start out by quoting Chris Hedges, the radical journalist, who stated a couple of months ago, America is a tinderbox. On August 9th, Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, became a flashpoint of the social explosion and, in fact, a rebellion against police violence, systemic racism, poverty, and in many ways puncturing the criminal oppressive system of American democracy and capitalism. But before we can speak about Ferguson, let's examine the state of working class people, the poor, and particularly people of color in this society. The last 45 years has seen an assault on our civil liberties, our democratic rights, and our human rights. Our unions have been viciously attacked. Our grassroots organization is paralyzed. Our leaders and our movements have been drowned in blood. Our leaders co-opted by the mainstream organizations and institutions that run this society. And both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are accomplices in these crimes against working class people, the poor, and people of color. But what was the turning point? In 1974 and 1975, there was an economic crisis. And that we saw American capitalism go through a new phase. In many ways, the laboratory took place in Chile, 1973. And the whole process of neoliberal capitalism was introduced within the American context. We saw massive budget cuts. We saw massive cuts to social and public spending. And today, as we commemorate the 50th anniversary on the War on Poverty by President Johnson, that brought a number of key programs to many working people like Head Start. Those programs were born out of social struggle because of the militancy of the Black freedom movement at that particular time. But today we've lived through 40 years of big business accumulating more and more wealth for the tiny 1%. In fact, when we look at it, since the economic crisis of 07-08 and the so-called recovery, 95% of the wealth has gone back to the top 1%. Working people are faced with the reality of low wages, of non-union jobs, of temporary or seasonal work. And this is a dominant feature in communities of color. The calendar year of July 2013 to this past July, 67% of the job growth have been low-wage jobs. Jobs that make $7 to $13 an hour. Mainly people of color, mainly youth and women occupy these jobs. Our youth have been under siege by the war on drugs, but we should call it the war on our youth. The war on drugs was an attempt to extinguish the revolutionary spirit of the youth of the 1960s and 70s. It was also about containing the Black working class and the Black youth, containing that surplus labor in society now that became idle, couldn't find work. It was slavery by another name. I want to give you this quick quote about the prison industrial complex. Between 1970 and 2000, the number of people incarcerated in the United States skyrocketed from 200,000 to 2.3 million. a tenfold increase. In 1930, 75% of all prison admissions were Caucasian, and 22% were African Americans. In 1992, 29% of the prison admissions were Caucasian, while 51% were African Americans and 20% were Hispanic. Today, 2/3 of the prisoners are African American or Hispanic. We see a total reversal of who is now occupying the cells, the dungeons within American society. We have 6 million people. 6 million people who are under correctional supervision, parole, probation, or prison. There are more black and brown bodies in the prisons of this so-called great nation than there were in slavery in 1850. Women of color are the fastest growing population in the prison system. And I haven't even talked about the immigrant population that are held down in detention centers. Prison is a place of human warehousing, cheap labor, and psychological terror. In these times of greater economic exploitation by the 1%, political disenfranchisement, and social alienation, the role of the police, first and foremost, is to serve and protect the property, the prestige, and the interests of the ruling elite. Funny enough, that there has been not one CEO arrested, indicted, or convicted for the economic meltdown in 07-08, or even arrested on tax evasion. If we think of companies like Microsoft, like GM, or Apple, or even Burger King now, who's attempting to go to Canada so they don't have to pay taxes. The rise of a highly militarized police is vital for big business to maintain its power and control over society. But it doesn't begin in Ferguson. In fact, it begins in the late 1960s. The counterintelligence program meant to squash, destroy the radical movements of the 60s and 70s. The FBI conducted 295 military actions against the movement. Out of that 295 military operations, 233 operations, 79%, was conducted at the Black Panther Party. SWAT, the Special Weapons Assault Team, was born, dressed for war. Black jump suits, black boots, head coverings, flak jackets, gas masks, and M16 rifles. The increase of this police state apparatus takes place at key moments. One, the war on drugs, of course. Every urban area had its own special force that would knock down doors, take grandmothers out of their homes and line them up against the wall. Or you would have the post-9/11 reality, where you have officers in military gear walking the subways, even walking in broad daylight throughout the street. For the United States, Ferguson was war games, an American population in shock. But let's remind ourselves about Occupy, only a few years ago, and the national coordinated effort to squash the Occupy movement, or even the history of the labor movement in this country. I was in Pittsburgh just a few weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to go to the Homestead Rebellion when the National Guard was called in to put down the great strike of Homestead in Pittsburgh. By the way, Ferguson, like other major cities in the country, received part of $450 million of military surplus in 2013. And what solidified that reality was in 1990, both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, in Congress, passed a law authorizing the funneling of surplus military equipment to police forces in your major cities and in your small towns. As a side note of the interconnected nature of the police and the military, next month in Missouri, at Fort Leonard Wood, there will be an expo of the military and the police, exhibiting the new highly mechanized weapons of warfare that they will use on you. For the American public, we're used to seeing that kind of tear gas and violence in Tunisia or Egypt or Turkey. But now it's being used on its own citizens. This highlights a system in crisis on one side, but really the weakness of American capitalism. That they must use this kind of force to subdue the working class and poor. The world has seen the hypocrisy of American democracy and capitalism. But something that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois said, which was very true, that a system cannot fail those that it was never meant to protect in the first place. So why Ferguson? Why people of color? Black and brown youth and workers? We must say and continue to hit home to anyone that we have conversations with. This nation was built on genocide and the extermination of the Native American population, and then rendering them to reservations, internal colonies within the United States. The violent extraction of labor of Africans to build the foundations of the wealth of this society. And then, of course, the daily exploitation of you and me as workers, wage slaves, those who were born here in the United States, and those immigrants who come to these shores. But why? Why, in many respects, is black and brown bodies and minds so disposable within the American construct? In his book, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, he states, nearly every manner of anti-black terror, oppression, and exploitation, from lynching to convict leasing to political disenfranchisement, brought forth new intellectual efforts of racial justification. The very health of the nation depended on the legitimate and unprecedented policies of subjugation, when workable in the light of African Americans' newly granted constitutional rights and malign neglect otherwise. The new social scientific imperative of the late 19th and early 20th century was to save the nation by measuring black inferiority through any sign of African Americans' failure to dominate or to lead or to even survive in modern society. These new scholars hope that post-emancipation demographic reports, with their tallies of birth, deaths, morbidity, and prisoners, would prove to be key indicators of the black fitness or lack thereof. In many ways, a whole racial construct was built after the radical Reconstruction period of 1877. And from 1877 to 1968, the birth of Jim Crow was meant to control and corral newfound free African labor. Politically, economically, socially, culturally, through music, through education, through the arts. They had to make sure that African Americans' humanity was never, ever given its proper place in American society. You keep in mind, we were property in this society. The New York Times piece, now that they're trying to kind of recant a bit about calling Mike Brown not an angel, that's not an accident. the American capitalist press has always been writing. If it's about African Americans, if it's about Native Americans, if it was about the Chinese arriving, the new Chinese laborers arriving in the United States in the 1870s, or the Mexican migrants coming out of Mexico following the Mexican Revolution of 1920, they've constructed the question of the other and the whole question of whiteness as a political construct to justify their policies of control and social control and power. Racism is vital for the divide and conquer of the working class as a whole, to force disunity among working people. At the same time, fostering a cancerous inferiority complex among communities of color. And those communities of color living in inhumane conditions like that of Gaza. And then by the wider society, the majority. The sense of acceptance for the use of state-sponsored or extrajudicial violence against the so-called other. That's why it's not too shocking that the right wing raised so much money for Brown's killer in the millions, in the thousands. Ferguson and which way forward? From LA to Chicago, to New Mexico, to right here in New York. Some of us participated in the Arizona demonstrations in Staten Island. In every urban or rural or suburban area, the violence against women and children of immigrants, the LGBT community, this is a daily occurrence. Every 28 hours, a person of color dies at the hands of police or vigilante or extrajudicial forces. But Ferguson dealt with another type of terrorism, economic terrorism. 70% of Ferguson is black, with 21,000, a quarter, living under the poverty line. Unemployment and low-wage work is the dominant feature in that town. 40% unemployment in the surrounding areas of Ferguson. The median household income in the district is $14,390 a year. St. Louis poverty stands at 30% in 2014. 1 million Missourians are impoverished out of a population of 6 million. Police and public officials are the majority. The majority are white who sit in public office. One of the most powerful streams of revenue for Ferguson is the traffic stops of black and brown working people. 86% last year of black and brown people stopped by the Ferguson police and given tickets. In Ferguson, there has been a historic housing discrimination that dates back to the 1960s. St. Louis is highly segregated as a city. Sisters and brothers, Ferguson is a neoliberal city. Ferguson is a continuum of the 2011 explosions around the world, the Arab Spring, the events of Occupy, the occupation of the Wisconsin Capitol. Ferguson now belongs in the pantheon of Watts, of the Newark Rebellion of 1967, of Harlem 1964, but in fact talk about political power and putting that political power in the hands of the working class and poor. August 9th was the tip of the iceberg. The 2 weeks of protests. And the only reason why we know about Ferguson is because the youth went out to the street. And they didn't stop. They didn't go home. There was a rejection of the Democratic Party and the so-called black leadership, which was co-opted many, many years ago, whose only interest is to defend the interests of American capitalism and democracy. Even their proxy forces, like Ileana Van Sant from the Oprah Network. Last night I had the opportunity, or the gut-wrenching opportunity, to watch her healing Ferguson as she appealed and tried to cajole these young people to stop. Let's talk about black-on-black violence. Let's talk about those things. This is what she was appealing to. Why anytime a rebellion like this takes place, we had to go back to the pathology of black folks and not talk about state power. That's the issue. She even attempted to recruit Common, who's a Chicago-based rapper who has the audacity to tell people to calm down in Ferguson, while Chicago, blood is running through the street, not just by black hands, but by a city administration that has destroyed the educational system in that city. And then you have the CEO of Empire, Barack Hussein Obama, who sent down 3 aides to Ferguson, then sent down Holder, the Attorney General. Let's remind ourselves who Obama is. He's dropped more drone bombs than Bush II, who just recently signed the Farmers Bill that cut $8.7 billion of food stamps that many working people in the poor, and particularly people of color, need to survive in this economic crisis. He's the same one that said, we've hurt and killed some people in this whole war on terror. Folks. Yes, we torture some folks. Sisters and brothers, for Socialist Alternative, we always understood that the post-racial construct, that paradigm, was a joke. But even more so now, it's torn asunder because of Ferguson. The rage that exploded says to me and to all of us that this system is rotten to its very core. Sharpton, at the funeral, which was nothing but a show, said that we have a few rotten apples. It's rotten because your tree and the seeds that you planted in the ground was rotten. And so we can't just pick the rotten apples from the tree. We must tear down the tree and replant some new seeds based on economic justice and true liberation and freedom for working people in the poor. My final point: how do we make Ferguson not a moment, but a movement? How do we make it a movement and not a moment that we forget about? First, the movement has to be built by our young people. They have the energy, the ingenuity. They have the fire in their bellies. They know what it means not to have adequate jobs in healthcare and education. They're the ones that will lead this struggle. New organizations must be built. We saw also the great example of the labor movement with letters of solidarity for the Ferguson Rebellion. But we got to translate those letters into actual resources, because the labor movement has human power and resources, not only to fight for better jobs and a living wage, but in fact to help organize these young people. We saw the international support when the sisters and brothers in Gaza sent letters saying, this is how you deal with tear gas. Our movement historically has always been about internationalism. At its very core, we never concerned ourselves what was going on in Harlem or going on in Ferguson. What was going on in Egypt? What was going on in Venezuela? That's the nature of our struggle. And we must return back to that idea of an internationalist perspective. We had the opportunity to send some forces down to Ferguson. And this was some of the demands, the democratic demands that we put forward to the youth of Ferguson. We said justice for Michael Brown, for his killer to be indicted and face trial, for a full independent investigation of the entire Ferguson Police Department by the community organizations and unions, for mass meetings in Ferguson to discuss the next steps and strategy against the repression, for elected leadership of the protests to come from the Ferguson community out of these meetings, for unions and community groups to build coalitions that spread the protests throughout the country, for democratic community control of the police, a $15 an hour minimum wage, and free quality education and health care, community control of policing overseen by local committees of democratically elected representatives from trade unions and community organizations, a united struggle against racism, repression, humiliation, exploitation of workers, youth, immigrants, and people of color, and a new Black freedom movement as part of a working class struggle against police violence, racism, low wages, and the two main political parties. These are democratic demands that got a very important hearing from the youth. We were able to help to organize, and hopefully it will last, an organization called Organize for Justice, Take Back Ferguson. We didn't go down there just trying to sell Socialist Alternative paper, but through dialogue and discussion, through organizing, we were able to have a hearing among the youth. Yes, we were those outside agitators that came in, but that is our role as a socialist organization, as revolutionaries. But these democratic demands cannot stand on its own. And I'll leave you with these words. To permanently uproot the police violence and racism and poverty in this society and in this world, we need a system change. The struggle for international democratic socialism is on the agenda. It is the question that is posed to you and I. Ferguson, let Ferguson be the first in so many. The whole question of from the media to Hollywood, violence has been normalized in this society. We don't even think much about it because we see it every day, right? We see the Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Sylvester Stallone films blowing up everything, and we watch those films and just kind of, okay, well but what effects does it have when we see real violence take place in real life, like a Ferguson, in fact, or like the events in Egypt, or the kind of torture chambers that the U.S. empire has used, particularly in those kind of countries too, in Egypt and Tunisia. And so this culture has normalized violence to such an extent that it's interesting why the liberal left or the liberal class have really been really silent on the question of Ferguson and other atrocities, in fact. There's been a question about, with the police, yes, it's a majority white police force. Do we need more black cops? Well, maybe in the early 20th century, that could have been an argument. But today, in many urban areas, you have majority black police officers. And in fact, the black police officers, the Latino police officers, or even the women police officers are more as vicious because they're wearing the blue. And so for their own officers, they have to make sure that, look, I'm down. Don't worry about it. I got no kind of sympathies to these folks. I'm gonna bust heads as hard and strong as you want me to. So when the struggle really develops in many ways, the whole question of class consciousness, because keep in mind, many police officers are of the working class. They are products, they're sons and daughters of working people. Now the question becomes, when those events do take place that can change consciousness, and this is where, as Marxists, when those struggles takes place, to have a dialogue, to have a way, to have a discussion with them. But let's be clear that the institution itself the institution itself is a violent institution. It's about repression, it's about subjugation, and there's no questions about that. That cannot be debated. But the question comes when that movement does develop. For example, if I think about Frank Serpico, right, who exposed police corruption in the 1970s, or say, for example, in Wisconsin, where many police officers stood to the side and even supported some of the people who were occupying the Capitol. Those are incidents. Yes, they're far and few between, but those are things that we have to look at, because it's the question about how can we break the kind of stranglehold that the ruling elite has. What kind of fissures what kind of ways that we can separate, in fact, their power structure? And that's a very important question. Now, the question of independent working class politics. Every November, or every May, or whenever the elections are, we go back to the ballot box and we vote for the same people and the same organizations and parties that continue to implement the same policies and agenda of Wall Street. In many ways, Sharma's victory in Seattle was a signal that there is a massive space that we can occupy as working class people, as organizers, as unions, to begin to run our own candidates based on our own program, our own agenda, in our own interests. That's what Sharma represents. That's what the Lorain County 12 in Ohio represents, in fact. Cal from Portland, Oregon, who ran as an independent for the city council. Right? There's a brother in Chicago who's running as an open socialist. There's a wider space now that we don't have to depend on run for the Democrat or support the Democratic Party, and clearly like the Republican Party, but particularly the Democratic Party, because we've been accustomed to an abusive relationship. It's an abusive relationship. We have to call it for what it is. When we have a dialogue with working people, Harvey Hawkins, who's part of the Green Party, who's a socialist, a trade unionist, running on a very working class program. When we go into the street, we raise his campaign. They say we must break from these parties of war and poverty, of police violence. How can Obama speak? He speaks with a fourth tongue when he talks about we got to stop for peace and stop the violence. Well, he's been violent all around the world. Yeah. He's the biggest criminal, actually. It's not the question of the police force, or it's the mindset of the police force. We see the militarization, but it's the mindset, the culture to which it embodies. So, raising Willie Horton, in many ways, once again, raises the pathology of black folks in that. If you're tough on crime, and every president has done that since Nixon, if you're tough on crime, you will get elected. You pander to the white middle class, or the white working class, white poor, actually, that see black folks or Puerto Ricans or Latinos or LGBTQ as the enemy. You gotta be fearful of them. Our struggle, and I want to end on this point, is international, has always been. Nabil raised the question of the UN. In 1951, there was a document produced called We Charge Genocide, written by William L. Patterson, who was a member of the Communist Party, Dr. Du Bois, Paul Robeson. This was the left of the black freedom struggle from the 1930s into the 40s and 50s. Malcolm X, who was organizing this whole question, would have worked, probably not, but posed the question of charges against America for crimes against 22 million African Americans in the United States, taking them to the United Nations. As a propaganda, it's powerful, actually. It was a total embarrassment for U.S. imperialism around the world, actually. You had Mao Zedong denouncing American racism and hypocrisy. The Soviet Union was laughing at America at that particular time. So African leaders were speaking about the civil rights movement in the United Nations. And so our movement has always been international, has always been linked to that question. Now the left in the United States has, unfortunately, a really pretty bad history when it comes to the question of race. The Socialist Party of the early 1900s, Communist Party up to a certain point when they did the work around the Scottsboro Boys, 1935. And then when they sided with the American imperialism, they kind of dropped the campaign and hold the question of race and they forged this whole question of race and black, white and black class unity. What's important, and I want to highlight this and particularly deal with David's question, because that's a very important question, is that we have to interlock both race and class, not supersede each other. For the youth of this generation, for Ferguson, the question of their racial identity or the level of their melanin becomes part of their political consciousness, the development of their political ideas. And so we cannot ignore that. That must be the gateway to having a dialogue with them about race as a construct, as a political, as based on political policy within the American society. It allows them then to begin to discuss not just their identity, but political ideas and how they can be part of the movement. But as Marxists, we don't stop there. We say that we need a class solution at the same time and bring forth a class unity. We support the right of self-determination for all oppressed people. But at the same time, we strive and struggle for the unity of the working class as a whole. Because that is what the ruling elite fears, a united movement. And so when we talk about the questions of race in America, this idea of the glass ceiling has been broken, right? Obama becomes president, and this is why the dialogue between him and Reverend Wright is important, right? Reverend Wright, old school liberation theology. He doesn't know it's a new America. There's no black America, white America. There's only one America. Obama says in 2004, right? American imperialism was in deep crisis. Bush, American empire was in the toilet, literally. And so you have this black man who, mind you, didn't spend a lot of time in the United States. Yes, he's a black man, but he's not the black man of a product of the United States. He born and raised in Hawaii. He's lived in Indonesia. He comes to the United States. He goes to Colombia. They didn't get that black man that's from Harlem. That's why Obama became president, because he didn't speak with the ferocity of the reality of being a black man in America. That's the key question, actually. That's why Obama. And they're fine, actually. They're fine. They are LGBTQ public officials. There's one in Houston, actually. She's the mayor of Houston. But she's carried out the neoliberal agenda down there. Look at this. We have majority now, many of urban cities, black mayors, LGBTQ public officials, women councilors, mayors. The key question is not the identity or the race, but in fact, will they carry out the agenda of Wall Street? That's the issue. That's the question. And so, in many ways, the struggle that's in front of us is paramount. And I thank you so much for this discussion. I thank you so much for being here, because we're going to make Ferguson not a moment, but a sustaining continuum of our struggle for socialism, solidarity, and true humanity.
This is for my folks who got bills. This is for my folks, check 1, 2. This is for my fuckers never lived like a hoe. Me and you toe to toe, I got love for the underdog. This is for my folks.